Welcome to the deep dive. If you, the listener, have ever puzzled over the persistent instability, militarism, and frankly, the fractured politics of the modern Middle East, today we are going back, right back to the roots.
Hmm.
We're cracking open a critical re-examination of history, one that really challenges the standard narrative, doesn't
Yeah.
it? That idea of inevitable failure, those tired tropes about ancient hatreds or, culturally determined chaos.
Exactly. That whole narrative just doesn't hold up when you look closely.
Our mission today is to locate that pivotal point where the region's path seems to have been fundamentally derailed, what
Hmm.
many historians are now calling the original sin of Western intervention.
Yeah, and then we're stepping right into that post-colonial era, the 1940s, the 1950s. It's a time often overlooked, actually. A moment where leaders across the Middle East were genuinely determined, it seems, to forge independent, modern, often secular states. And the sources we're diving into today argue pretty forcefully
Yeah.
that the crises we see now, the entrenched authoritarianism, the rise of political Islam as this dominant force, these aren't organic failures. They're modern phenomena,
Modern phenomena.
directly incited, fueled, institutionalized by external powers who again and again uh, systematically subverted those initial hopes, those aspirations for something different.
So the core thesis here, it's complex, but it's also, well, quite devastating. The United States, coming out of World War II, victorious, but maybe blinded by this growing Cold War obsession, this anti-communism.
In economic interests, absolutely.
Yes, the need to secure access to cheap oil, protect global capitalism. It made a kind of devil's pact, didn't it? Choosing autocrats and strongmen over potentially democratic or independent nationalist movements.
That's the argument. And it starts decisively with interventions in Iran and Egypt. Those choices fundamentally prioritize strategic control over, say, political development or genuine self-determination.
And that laid the foundation for decades of chaos. Defined U.S. foreign policy for generations.
Pretty much. It's the story of the road not taken, you could say.
Yeah. And that's why this deep dive is, I think, indispensable for you, the listener. If you really want to understand why seemingly stable countries imploded later on, why secular nationalism ultimately failed in many places, and why political Islam was positioned almost perfectly to fill that vacuum, the answer isn't back in the 8th century.
No, absolutely not. It lies in these catastrophic, arguably cynical decisions made in Washington, D.C. and London during the early Cold War. We're going to track how this initial moment of surprising goodwill was just completely squandered.
Which leads us right into our first section, identifying the architects of what our sources call this informal empire. Okay, let's really unpack this history because there's a powerful irony right at the start, isn't there? For a very brief window, right after World War II, the United States was actually seen pretty positively across the Middle East, especially compared to the old European powers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That goodwill is the tragic starting point, really. You have to
Right.
think about the context. Britain and France, centuries of formal colonial rule, they left behind this legacy of, well, resentment, extraction.
Right, exploitation.
Exactly. America, though, technically had no formal history of empire in Muslim lands. So Washington was seen, at least initially, by many emerging nationalists as a potential counterbalance, someone to maybe help push back against the declining but still dangerous European powers.
And I know our sources point out the U.S. had established significant educational institutions like the American University of Beirut, Robert College in Istanbul, hospitals too. This built a reputation, maybe not entirely deserved, but a reputation for benevolence, advancement, not just pure extraction like the Brits or French.
Precisely. And on a practical level, when the U.S. signed that agreement with Saudi Arabia to start oil exploration back in 1933, many local leaders actually saw American involvement as a way to decrease their dependency on Great Britain, the imperial colossus, as it was often called.
Less than British influence.
Yeah. But as you said, that positive view, it didn't last long. The turning point seems to be this fundamental shift in U.S. strategic thinking, really cemented by one single policy document in 1950.
And you're talking about NSC 68, National Security Council Report 68. I think a lot of listeners know this was about containment, the Cold War strategy. But the sources we're looking at show it became a blueprint for something, well, far more aggressive, didn't it?
That's a really critical distinction.
Yeah.
NSC 68, it was top secret at the time, crafted in 1950. It didn't just recommend containment. It demanded the militarization of the entire Cold War response.
Militarization.
Yeah. It pushed the U.S. to vastly increase military spending, go after the hydrogen bomb, and launch what it literally termed an all-out war against godless communism. But here's the kicker. What makes it so terrifyingly relevant for the Middle East?
Go on.
It's the expansive, almost paranoid definition of the enemy it established.
So it wasn't just targeting, like, the Kremlin or actual card-carrying Communist Party members.
Oh, not at all. NSC 68 essentially declared that any political ideology deviating from American-style liberal capitalism was a potential threat. The definition of the enemy ballooned to include socialism in both real and, crucially, imagined manifestations.
Imagined manifestations? What does that even mean?
It meant things like third world nationalism, non-alignment. If a newly independent nation just wanted to pursue its own path, maybe state-led development, maybe nationalizing its resources to fund healthcare or education.
Without signing up for Team America, basically.
Exactly. Without joining Pax Americana, that act alone was immediately branded as a potential Soviet advance, or at least opening the door to one.
Wow. So that created this incredibly rigid binary worldview, black and white, good versus evil, and it justified violence, intervention against any leader just seeking a genuine economic or political independence.
Precisely. It completely shut down any possibility of neutral ground. You were either with us or you were suspect. And leading this new crusade, you had two men who perfectly embodied this synthesis of ideological fervor and corporate interest: the Dulles brothers.
Ah, yes. John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles, the CIA director.
The architects.
The dual architects, yeah. They designed and executed this new foreign policy approach.
It's often forgotten, I think, just how steep they were in that specific Calvinist ideology, this idea of predestination, good versus evil.
Absolutely. They genuinely viewed the struggle against the Soviets as a spiritual battle, almost apocalyptic, absolute good versus absolute evil. No shades of gray.
And that religious conviction, it merged pretty seamlessly with their material interests, didn't it?
Oh, completely. John Foster Dulles, he was at one point the best paid lawyer in America, a senior partner at the huge Wall Street firm Sullivan and Cromwell. Both brothers represented massive U.S. multinational corporations all over the globe.
Right.
They really seemed to operate under the belief that, well, what was good for America and American capitalism was therefore good for God and good for the world.
Right.
There was no conflict there in their minds.
And it's fascinating, the family precedent you mentioned in the outline. That almost normalized interventionism for them. It absolutely did. Their maternal grandfather, John W. Foster, he was Secretary of State back when the U.S. helped depose the Hawaiian monarchy in 1893.
Wow.
A clear case of using U.S. power to secure commercial interests, sugar in that case. So when the Dulles brothers took the reins of U.S. foreign policy and clandestine operations in the early 1950s, they had the ideological mandate from NSC 68, the corporate connections, and this family history. They were ready to launch this new informal empire, committed to making sure that assertive nationalism didn't get in the way of American global dominance.
And the first major casualty of this new informal empire, the clearest example maybe of this original sin we talked about, was Iran, 1953.
Right.
And the catalyst was a concept that seems simple today, but was truly revolutionary back then. National control over natural resources, specifically oil.
Indeed. And the central figure, of course, was Mohammad Mossadegh, Iran's first democratically elected prime minister. In 1951, he achieved what many Iranians had dreamed of for decades: the nationalization of the oil sector.
Which was controlled by the British through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC.
Exactly. And for Mossadegh, this was way more than just an economic calculation. He viewed control over oil as an invaluable symbol of national independence. He famously argued that the moral aspect of sovereignty far outweighed the purely economic aspect.
Yeah, that's a powerful statement. But it put him on a direct collision course with Great Britain, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And we have to emphasize just how critical that Iranian oil was to the UK economy, especially after World War II.
Right. How critical?
Well, the AIOC refinery at Abdel, it was the single largest oil refinery complex in the world at the time. And AIOC was Britain's single largest overseas enterprise. Full stop.
Wow.
The revenue stream was just staggering. In 1950 alone, AIOC generated profits of $170 million. Now, if you adjust that for the relative size of the UK economy back then, it's equivalent to nearly £7 billion today.
£7 billion.
And here's the key point. That revenue stream almost exactly equaled the total value of Britain's Marshall Plan loans from the U.S. between 48 and 52.
So losing that oil wasn't just an economic hit. It was potentially catastrophic for Britain.
Catastrophic. Britain was functionally bankrupt after the war. They could not, under any circumstances, afford to lose that oil revenue. They were never genuinely prepared to accept nationalization, despite going through the motions of negotiation.
So Britain was desperate. But the Americans, initially under Truman, were actually a bit hesitant, weren't they? They saw Mossadegh more as an anti-colonial figure, maybe eccentric, but not necessarily a communist pawn.
That's right. It was really Britain's desperation combined with the shift in the U.S. under Eisenhower and the Dulles brothers, that rising Cold War paranoia fueled by NSC 68 that fused the Anglo-American alliance against Mossadegh.
So let's talk about Mossadegh the man. What was lost when he was overthrown? Our sources paint a picture of someone quite different from the Western caricature.
Very different. He wasn't a communist. He was actually a constitutional monarchist, fiercely anti-Soviet in many ways. But he was also a genuine Democrat.
Yeah.
The sources describe him as impassioned, maybe a bit eccentric, sure, but deeply committed.
Committed to what specifically?
To the rule of law, to economic justice, to genuine constitutionalism. He pushed through significant land reforms, introduced social security programs, and was gradually empowering women. He was famously informal, conducted state business in his pajamas sometimes.
I read that, and he wept publicly.
Yes, which was seen in Iran as a sign of genuine emotional honesty, empathy. Of course, the Western press mocked it as theatrical or weak, but his goal was clear: build a solvent, frugal, secular-leaning state, kind of in the mold of a modern European constitutional monarchy.
So hardly a revolutionary threat plotting world domination, more like a nationalist reformer.
Exactly. But the British, totally frustrated by his defiance, his symbolic use of oil sovereignty, they played directly into the Americans' escalating fear of communist contagion.
Which leads us straight to the coup plot, Operation TPAJAX.
Infamous, yeah. The British basically convinced the new Eisenhower administration, especially the Dulles brothers, that Mossadegh's non-alignment, combined with the tactical alliance he had with the communist-leaning Two-Day Party.
Which he needed for political support against the Shah's allies.
Right, precisely. He needed their street power. The British argued this alliance meant Iran was inevitably heading for a communist takeover. Now, this fear was explicitly and, frankly, cynically manipulated.
How do we know that?
Well, former CIA analyst Richard Cottam later admitted, quite candidly, that the British consciously played on that fear. They used the Cold War rhetoric to pull the U.S. into what was, at its core, a colonial dispute over oil, dressed up in anti-communist clothes.
And this is where the new American strategy, the informal empire toolkit, really gets deployed, under Alan Dulles at the CIA.
It was a classic hybrid operation, not tanks rolling in initially. It was about corruption, propaganda, plausible deniability.
So how did it work on the ground?
The CIA, specifically Agent Kermit Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, ironically funneled massive cash payments. The operational budget was surprisingly small, reportedly less than $100,000.
Only $100,000.
For the core operation, yes. Used to bribe street thugs, key politicians, military officers, journalists. They organized staged mobs, counter-demonstrations, essentially manufacturing chaos to make Mossadegh's democratic government look unstable and violent.
And the propaganda machine went into overdrive, targeting American and international opinion.
Oh, yeah. The New York Times started calling Mossadegh a dictator. Time magazine, hugely influential then, called the situation in Iran one of the worst calamities to the anti-communist world since the Red Conquest of China. Just completely overblown rhetoric.
Wow. Well, internally, the CIA was apparently calling the Shah a wimp.
Exactly. CIA operatives internally referred to the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, as indecisive, lacking backbone. They had to pressure him heavily, almost bully him into signing the decrees needed to dismiss Mossadegh.
So the first attempt actually failed, didn't it?
It did. Mossadegh got wind of it. But the second phase, relying heavily on that manufactured street violence and crucially key military units switching sides thanks to bribes, that succeeded. Mossadegh was arrested. The immediate operational cost to the CIA was minimal.
But the payoff for the U.S. and the long-term cost for Iran? Astronomical.
Absolutely. The coup itself cost maybe $100,000.
Yeah.
But immediately after, the U.S. rushed in an emergency $45 million grant to the new military regime under General Zahedi and then directly to the Shah. It cemented the deal. U.S. support in exchange for access and alignment.
And the Shah delivered on his end of the bargain.
He did. Once he was firmly back in control, propped up by U.S. backing, he immediately abolished Mossadegh's key reforms, the land reform and Social Security. And critically, he signed the 1954 consortium agreement.
The oil deal.
The oil deal. It reversed the nationalization, effectively. But instead of just Britain controlling it, the new consortium gave U.S. companies a massive 40% stake in Iran's oil production. The UK got 40%, and other smaller players the rest. The U.S. had successfully elbowed Britain aside to become the dominant political and economic player influencing Iran's resources.
And this directly leads to the establishment of the brutal police state that came to define the Shah's rule for the next, 25 years?
Directly. And the U.S. actively enabled it. In 1957, the U.S. FBI and significantly the CIA helped the Shah establish the infamous SOVAC, the secret police.
SOVAC, known for its brutality.
Extreme brutality.
Yeah.
The CIA provided extensive training, counterintelligence techniques, interrogation methods, organizational structure. The Shah then built these maximum security prisons, like the notorious Evin prison in Tehran, often based explicitly on U.S. models.
So the very system that crushed dissent was, in part, American-designed and trained.
Yes. And the crushing of secular constitutional democracy, the imprisonment, torture, execution of secular opposition figures, liberals, socialists, anyone who challenged the Shah. It created a profound political vacuum.
A vacuum that eventually got filled?
Exactly. When the revolution finally erupted in 1979, after decades of that brutal repression under a U.S.-backed autocrat, the only potent, organized, alternative ideology left standing, the only force capable of mobilizing the masses against the Shah and his American patrons, was political Islam, led by Ayatollah Khomeini.
The blowback is just astonishingly clear when you lay it out like that. That 1953 decision wasn't about securing stability. It ultimately secured 4 decades of U.S.-Iran conflict, the rise of theocracy, deep regional hostility.
And the legacy of that coup, that original sin, is absolutely still being paid for today in blood and treasure.
Okay, so if Mossadegh in Iran represented the defeat of, let's say, constitutional democracy, our next case study, Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, represents the defeat of the other great hope, maybe, for the region at that time, aggressive, centralized state nationalism focused on rapid development.
That's a really important distinction, yeah. Nasser was fundamentally different from Mossadegh. He was a military man, came from a middle-class background, a fervent nationalist, but definitely not a Democrat.
Right. The source mentioned he viewed democracy as a luxury that Egyptians cannot afford. A bit cynical, perhaps?
Perhaps, or maybe pragmatic from his perspective. His goal was modernization, state-led development, lifting millions of Egyptians out of centuries of grinding poverty. Constitutional niceties weren't his priority, but crucially, Nasser was initially strongly anti-communist.
Anti-communist, so potentially an ally for the U.S.
You'd think so. He actively looked to the U.S. initially for friendship, for aid, for military support. He wanted help countering residual British influence, especially around the Suez Canal zone, and he desperately needed financing for massive infrastructure projects. The big one, of course, was the Aswan High Dam.
The Aswan Dam, yeah. A symbol of modernization for Egypt. So here you have a potential long-term strategic partner, anti-Soviet, focused on nation building, popular. Why couldn't the Dulles administration work with him? Why couldn't they look past his non-alignment? Surely securing the region against actual Soviet influence was the main goal.
Logically, yes. But the problem was that rigid binary worldview established by NSC 68. The Dulles brothers simply could not tolerate a powerful, independent, non-aligned leader like Nasser, who insisted on true sovereignty.
So what did they demand?
They insisted on Nasser fully joining the anti-communist military alliance structure, basically signing up for Pax Americana. And they also demanded that he normalize relations with Israel, which was politically impossible for him at the time, given the recent 1948 war and the Palestinian refugee crisis.
They treated him like a potential client state, not a sovereign partner.
Exactly. And Nasser saw these conditions, rightly or wrongly, as a clear attempt to compromise Egypt's hard-won political autonomy after decades of British domination.
And that American intransigence, that refusal to accept his terms, it turned a potential ally into a lasting foe, didn't it? It really came to a head when Egypt needed weapons for self-defense.
Yes. The path to confrontation was paved with these U.S. conditions. There was a major Israeli raid on Gaza in February 1955, a really bloody affair. Egypt felt incredibly vulnerable, desperately needed defensive arms.
And the U.S. said no.
The U.S. refused to provide them unconditionally. They kept tying arms sales to political subservience, to joining their alliances. So Nasser made a strategic choice. National security had to come first. If the West wouldn't sell him weapons, he'd look elsewhere.
To the Soviet bloc.
He turned to the Soviet bloc via Czechoslovakia, finalizing the Czech arms deal in September 1955. His logic, as he explained it, was simple. It would be futile to build schools and hospitals if he lacked the means to defend Egypt from external attack.
Makes sense from his perspective. But the U.S. Cold Warriors must have been absolutely furious. They'd see this purely as a Soviet victory, a sign of Nasser slipping into the enemy camp.
They were livid. They saw it exactly like that, a major blow to their strategy, proof of his untrustworthiness. And this anger, this feeling of betrayal, led directly to the spark that ignited the 1956 Suez Crisis.
Which was the withdrawal of funding for the Aswan Dam.
Yes. In direct retaliation for Nasser's non-alignment, and especially the Czech arms deal, the Eisenhower administration, pushed hard by Doles, abruptly withdrew the promised financing for the massive Aswan Dam project in July 1956. It was a calculated public act of economic humiliation.
And Nasser's response, equally dramatic.
Swift and iconic. Just days later, he nationalized the Suez Canal Company, which was still largely owned by British and French shareholders. He declared that the canal's revenues, which were substantial, would now be used to fund the dam's construction.
Wow. A direct check.
It was this incredible symbolic act of defiance. It immediately galvanized the Arab world, resonated hugely across the post-colonial nations. It really mirrored the kind of sovereignty over resources that Mossadegh had demanded just a few years earlier in Iran.
But this time, the reaction wasn't just a covert CIA coup. It involved an overt, coordinated invasion by 3 nations. Tell us about that secret plot, the Protocol of Sèvres.
Right. This was old-school imperialism making a comeback.
Yeah.
The UK, under Prime Minister Anthony Eden, and France, both furious over the nationalization and frankly eager to topple Nasser, whom they saw as a menace, met secretly with Israel in Sèvres outside Paris in October 1956.
What did they agree?
They concocted a detailed secret plan. Israel would launch a major attack on Egypt across the Sinai Peninsula. This invasion would then serve as a pretext for Britain and France to intervene, supposedly as peacekeepers, separating the combatants.
But really to seize the canal zone and overthrow Nasser.
Exactly. They completely deceived the world, including their most important ally, the United States, about their collusion and their true intentions. This secret collusion, by the way, fundamentally reinforced the widespread Arab belief that Israel was acting primarily as an imperial outpost, a tool planted by the West to maintain control.
Okay, but here's the magnificent irony, isn't it? The U.S. arguably triggered the whole crisis by humiliating Nasser over the dam funding. But then President Eisenhower was forced to condemn the invasion launched by his closest allies.
He had absolutely no choice. Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles, despite their animosity towards Nasser, recognized immediately that this blatant old-school European gunboat diplomacy would be a geopolitical disaster for the West.
Why?
It would push the entire Arab world firmly into the Soviet orbit. Nasser would look like a martyr resisting Western aggression. And crucially, it threatened vital Western access to Middle Eastern oil by potentially destabilizing the entire region and closing the canal.
So Eisenhower acted decisively, not out of any love for Nasser.
Not at all. It was pure Cold War, realpolitik, and fear of Soviet gains. Eisenhower went public, condemned the invasion, took it to the UN, and most importantly, he applied immediate and punishing economic pressure, especially on Britain. He allowed the British pound sterling to depreciate dramatically on international markets, threatening to collapse the UK's entire financial system if they didn't withdraw.
Wow. American economic muscle saves Nasser. Yet Washington still refused any kind of reconciliation or rapprochement with him afterward.
That's the lasting tragedy of the episode. Instead of seeing this as maybe an opportunity Nasser was indebted to the U.S. for saving him, perhaps a chance for a reset, the U.S. doubled down on the rivalry.
How so?
They suspended economic aid to Egypt, and then, in early 1957, they launched the Eisenhower Doctrine. This promised U.S. military and economic intervention to protect any Middle Eastern nation against overt armed aggression from any nation controlled by international communism.
But everyone knew it was really aimed at containing Nasser.
Absolutely. It was explicitly designed to counter Nasser's rising influence, his brand of pan-Arab nationalism. This doctrine effectively set off what historians call the Arab Cold War.
Pitting U.S. allies against Nasser's allies.
Exactly. Pro-Western, conservative monarchies like Saudi Arabia and Jordan, backed by the U.S., versus the Arab nationalist republics like Egypt, Syria, later Iraq, often looking to the Soviet Union for support.
And that regional rivalry sounds incredibly destructive for any prospect of domestic growth or unity.
It was devastating. This Arab Cold War consumed vast financial resources on arms races and proxy conflicts. It fatally weakened pan-Arab institutions like the Arab League. It diverted Egypt's resources and other countries' resources away from the domestic development and poverty alleviation that leaders like Nasser had originally championed.
So the American animosity, that refusal to accept a non-aligned developmental path, it created what the source calls a geostrategic curse.
Yeah, that's the term used. Forcing countries into these rigid alignments, Washington or Moscow, fueling regional conflicts. And ensuring that genuine indigenous political and social change remains deeply blocked, arguably, even today. The shadow of Suez and that U.S.-Nasser rivalry is long.
No, it is absolutely crucial, I think, for you, our listener, to understand that Iran in 53 and Egypt in 56, these weren't just isolated, one-off regional responses to unique geopolitical
No,
problems.
not at all.
Our sources make a really strong case that they were actually just the Middle Eastern deployment of a standardized global strategy, a strategy of, well, informal empire.
That's exactly right. The playbook established in Tehran, using propaganda, economic pressure, funding street agitation, leveraging Cold War paranoia, ultimately to protect corporate interests and ensure alignment, it was seen as so successful it was replicated almost immediately.
Yeah, you're next.
Just 1 year after the Iran coup in 1954, the U.S. Cold Warriors, specifically the Dollar brothers and the CIA, took the exact same blueprint and deployed it in Central America to overthrow the democratically elected president Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala.
Guatemala in 1954, and the analogy between the corporate interests involved there and in Iran, it's almost uncanny, isn't it?
It's incredibly powerful and impossible to ignore. In Iran, the trigger was the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and the nationalization of oil. In Guatemala, the dominant force was the massive U.S.-owned United Fruit Company.
United Fruit. Known locally as El Pulpo, the octopus,
Yeah.
right? Because its tentacles were everywhere.
Precisely. It had a stranglehold on the nation's economy, infrastructure, even politics. And Arbenz's great crime, in their eyes, was passing moderate land reform legislation Decree 900.
What did it do?
It aimed to create a more modern capitalist economy, actually, by redistributing large tracts of unused private land, mainly owned by United Fruit, to landless peasant farmers. This directly threatened United Fruit's near-total dominance and its highly profitable, low-cost operations.
And the power disparity here was just immense, wasn't it, between the company and the government?
Huge. By 1950, United Fruit's annual profits were around $65 million. That was more than twice the entire annual revenue of the Guatemalan government itself.
Twice the government's revenue.
They were essentially a parallel state. They owned the ports, the railways, the telegraph lines. They couldn't tolerate any meaningful regulation, let alone having their unused land redistributed.
And the conflicts of interest among the American architects of the coup in Washington, they weren't just present, they were staggering, almost laughably blatant.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
John Foster Duell's old law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell, they had drafted the original, very favorable agreements for United Fruit in Guatemala decades earlier and continued to represent them.
Okay.
Alan Dulles himself, the CIA director orchestrating the coup. He had previously served on United Fruit's board of trustees, and Robert Cutler, Eisenhower's national security advisor, also a former board member of United Fruit.
So the very people deciding U.S. policy had direct financial and professional ties to the company whose interests were threatened.
Exactly. The lines between what was good for the U.S. government, what was good for fighting communism, and what was good for the United Fruit Company's bottom line were, well, they weren't just blurred, they were practically erased.
Even though Arbenz himself was a reform-minded nationalist trying to build a modern capitalist economy, not some Soviet puppet.
Absolutely. He wasn't a communist. He was an army officer trying to modernize his country. But the Dulles brothers and their allies deliberately conflated his land reform program and his non-aligned stance with the ever-present amorphous fear of godless communism. It fit the NSC 68 worldview perfectly.
Was there any real communist threat?
It was minuscule. Guatemala's actual Communist Party, the PGT, had fewer than 200 registered members at the time, out of a population of 3 million. It had marginal influence in the government. Yet the CIA planning memo for the coup, declassified later, actually proposed fabricating evidence of Soviet arms shipments and communist subversion to create a public pretext for intervention.
Just like they played up the Tudeh-party connection in Iran.
Precisely. They used the shadow army, recruited and financed mercenaries in neighboring Honduras and Nicaragua. They set up a clandestine radio station broadcasting propaganda into Guatemala, calling for revolt. They bombed Guatemala City from unmarked planes. It was Operation TPAJX, adapted for Central America.
The goal is the same?
The consistent goal, whether you're looking at Tehran in 53, Cairo in 56, or Guatemala City in 54, was crystal clear. Subdue assertive nationalists. Leaders who pursued a state-directed, non-aligned path, especially if that path threatened Western corporate dominance or the rigid demands of Cold War alignment.
And the human cost in Central America following that coup, it was arguably even more immediate and brutal than in the Middle East, wasn't it? It really illustrates that this informal empire strategy was anything but clean or bloodless.
That's tragically true. While the Iran coup led to decades of sustained, institutionalized authoritarianism under the Shah, the U.S. intervention in Guatemala instantly plunged the country into a brutal 36-year civil war.
36 years.
A conflict that ultimately claimed the lives of over 200,000 people, mostly indigenous Mayan civilians, targeted by U.S.-backed military regimes. This standardized playbook intervenes covertly, use anti-communism as the excuse, secure corporate interests, crush genuine attempts at democratic reform or state-led development. It left this horrific legacy of instability, violence, and deep-seated anti-American sentiment across multiple continents.
So let's try to synthesize this. We've covered a lot of ground. What were the monumental long-term costs of this 1950s policy? This deep dive really forces us, and you, the listener, to confront the argument that America's cynical calculation back then effectively arrested political development across much of the Middle East.
Yeah, that's a central claim in the sources.
It sustained deeply authoritarian strongmen, the Shah in Iran, later figures like Sadat in Egypt who aligned with the U.S., the Saudi rulers.
Regimes that prioritize stability for Western interests over the rights or aspirations of their own people.
It fueled militarism and destructive rivalries, like that Arab Cold War we discussed, between newly formed states that might otherwise have cooperated.
Definitely diverted resources and attention from development.
And crucially, maybe most consequentially, it paved the way for political Islam to emerge as the only potent, credible alternative ideology to secular nationalism, which had been discredited or crushed, often with U.S. help.
That is the ultimate devastating blowback outlined in the material we reviewed. By systematically undermining or destroying the secular, constitutional, or genuinely nationalist movements, by extinguishing Mossadegh's vision for a secular, potentially prosperous Iran, or by alienating Nasser's developmental nationalism, the U.S. inadvertently, or perhaps negligently, empowered the religious far right.
And then the U.S. doubled down later, didn't it? Backing ultra-conservative Islamic-dominated states like Saudi Arabia for its oil and anti-Soviet stance.
And later, most famously, supporting the Afghan Mujahideen, including figures who had formed the Taliban and al-Qaeda purely as an anti-communist tactic against the Soviets in Afghanistan.
So you're describing essentially the fundamental ideological architecture that led down the road to the devastation we saw on September 11, 2001.
Well, the sources we looked at are explicit in drawing this very direct, very disturbing line. They argue that the roots of that catastrophe trace back directly to these cynical Cold War decisions made decades earlier. The U.S. supported these regimes and movements to combat the godless communists. But that very act, the argument goes, created the breeding grounds, the networks, the hardened ideologies, and the military skills for the ultra-conservative jihadi movements that later turned their guns against their former patron, the American homeland. Al-Qaeda and its ideological ancestors were, in this interpretation, children of the Cold War's unintended consequences.
It really makes you wonder profoundly about the missed opportunity. What if the U.S. had simply tolerated independent states with different national priorities back in the 50s? What if they'd allowed Iran, Egypt, maybe Syria and Iraq to pursue their own developmental paths, even if they were non-aligned?
Could we have seen a more stable, more prosperous, perhaps eventually a more democratic Middle East?
Yeah.
The intellectual capacity was certainly there. The resources, especially oil wealth, were potentially available. The source material strongly suggests that countries like Egypt, Iraq, Syria, maybe Lebanon, they had the potential to become the four Arab tigers.
Like the East Asian tigers. Exactly. Leveraging their resources, their educated populations, their proximity to European markets to follow a kind of secular, state-guided, infrastructure-focused development path similar to what happened in South Korea or Taiwan. Instead, we inherited this legacy marked by dependency, weak political institutions, economies distorted by oil or conflict, and systems deeply prone to authoritarianism, the complete antithesis, ironically, of the democratic values Washington always claimed to champion.
It feels like the constant, bitter lesson of history, doesn't it? Short-sighted tactical decisions driven by fear or greed almost always evolve into long-term strategic nightmares. And that brings us perfectly to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider, something that loops right back to Iran.
Think about the current nuclear standoff with Iran. It dominates headlines, right? We often perceive Iran's nuclear program as this radical, purely clerical pursuit, something that started only after the 1979 Islamic Revolution.
Right, the Mullah's bomb. But the history is much more complicated and much more ironic. Iran's original nuclear program was actually initiated, encouraged, and materially supported by the United States itself back in the 1950s and 60s.
Under the Shah.
Under the Shah.
Yeah.
The guy the U.S. put in power.
The very same. The U.S. launched the Atoms for Peace initiative under Eisenhower. As part of that, they provided Iran, the Shah's Iran, with its first nuclear research reactor in Tehran in 1967. They supplied technicians, they even supplied weapons-grade enriched uranium fuel for it initially. Washington actively commended the Shah's atomic ambitions back then.
So let me get this straight. The U.S. actively helped its autocratic client state, the Shah, build the very foundation for a nuclear program, providing the initial technology, the fuel, the expertise,
Yes.
only for that entire foundation, that knowledge base, to be inherited and eventually revived by the fiercely anti-American clerical regime that overthrew the Shah. A program revived in 1984, reportedly, after the shock of the Iran-Iraq War.
Yeah.
Exactly that. What does this history of intervention, followed by technological sharing with an autocratic ally, tell you? It suggests that the tactical move designed to secure an ally against the Soviets, achieve a short-term political goal, maybe sell American technology, always carries this exponential unforeseen risk down the line. The decisions made in the 1950s weren't just about securing oil then. They were, indirectly, about underwriting a potential nuclear arms race now. The lesson seems undeniable. Arrogance, imperial overreach, even when cloaked in the rhetoric of immediate security or fighting communism, inevitably produces these catastrophic, unintended consequences that continue to haunt generations. That original sin, as the historians called it, is still being paid for. In perpetuity, perhaps.